free. I think we're free. Oh, we're passing share. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. How's that at the back? Can you hear us again? Hi, everyone. I'm Pamela Robinson. I am an urban planning professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. And I have the awesome privilege of being the moderator for this great panel today. We've got 50 minutes to do it. We're going to try to give a little bit of room for questions at the end. But if it's juicy and we really get going, lunch is going to be chatty and interactive, and there are lots of, this is a nice small conference, so we'll do our best, but if we don't get questions now, we'll get you on later. This panel is called From Tools to Civic Infrastructure, Centering Community Expertise for More Accountable AI. And what we're going to do today is we're really going to focus on the shift from AI as a tool to AI as civic infrastructure. And the infrastructure framing, we think, creates important opportunities for new ways of thinking and doing. But with thinking about AI as infrastructure and public infrastructure, which is important, which we can talk about, it also creates a series of obligations for the ways in which we work. And so that's how we've started to frame this conversation. And so we're really, thinking about this idea of you can opt out of using an app, but you can't opt out of using civic infrastructure. And so we want to remind everyone about just how important the public elements are. And this public framing of AI is a fundamental value that everyone shares here and takes up the work in different ways. And it creates a really important opportunity, I think, to think and work differently across the sectors we're in. So without further ado, we're going to get going right away. So I'm going to start. We're going to do some introductions, but folks are going to introduce themselves because it's really cringy when other people introduce you. And so we're going to ask them to introduce themselves. And we're going to ask you about what do you really think he's missing from conversations about AI right now. Jackie, you get to go first.
Yeah, maybe because I think I'm going to pull it out of the wall if I do that. So I actually just introduced myself earlier, but I will do this for the benefit of the recorder. I'm Jacqueline Liu. I'm founder of Helpful Places. We steward digital trust for places and routines, which is an open source communication standard that's been deployed in more than 15 cities. And we've recently sort of evolved DTPR to be explicit for AI. And so you can sort of think of it, for those of you that are familiar with constructs like AI model cards, you can think of it as something that's actually designed for residents to use rather than by experts for experts. And I think one of the things that's really missing is legibility. Not just transparency, not just piles of PDFs on a public website, but genuine public understanding. We've got all of these sort of transparency artifacts that are actually written for a compliance audience or for a regulatory audience. And so I think the thing that I keep coming back to is that you can't contest what you can't see. And so the work that is missing, or sort of one of the things that we're missing and what we're really pointed at, is how do you enable that seeing?
Right, do you want to go next? Who's start?
Hi, everybody. I am so happy to be with you. We started the conversation yesterday, and the people in this room are really at the vanguard of these conversations. I am a program director for AI Civics at Data in Society, and we just launched it this week. So I'm really excited to share a bit more about what we're doing. Data in Society is a nonprofit research institute that studies the impacts of data and automation. And my research is really focused on how to support the public to contest and shape AI systems. And I think we're all experiencing something similar, which is that AI is hitting us like a tidal wave. It's impossible to escape it in the news and popular media, and even a lot of the text that I find myself consuming these days seems to have been written by AI. But as we try to organize ourselves to respond to this, it seems like there's a lot of emphasis on use. Like, how do we use it better? How do we get more literate so that we can use it? And there's not enough of a conversation about how do we shape it? What exactly are those levers for us to step into a more authorial role with AI? So AI Civics is intended to be a national conversation and design research initiative where we will co-create resources asking the following questions. What are those levers that exist for the public to shape AI? Where are communities already doing this? How can we amplify those lessons? And what is needed? What are the other materials and supports that people need in order to help propagate these successful models of community control?
Betsy.
Right, and Jake Hirsch-Allen, also from Toronto, around the corner from UP's place, which is sort of bizarre that we've transported this small neighborhood in Toronto to New York.
But also, we can't have this conversation in Toronto.
It's true, yeah. Pamela and I, we work in the same university. It flies away for each other. So I'm grateful, not only for this community, but frankly for all of that community. I got off the plane and was sort of scared based on obviously the past 2 years, and it was just this flood of energy from New York City get me in a way that I'm very grateful for. So they do all that an amazing place, and it's amazing because of you. So thank you for having me. All right, so I'll actually start with myself and then get to the think tank, because I've had 3 disillusioning careers. First in international law, public international law, and then intellectual property law, where I just felt like I couldn't create change I had hoped in those professions of those fields. I then created this opera boot camp, which when it was created in Canada, it became the largest, and I think to create a lot of sort of positive impact at a time when we needed more software developers. And it went bankrupt 2 years ago because we need less software developers in. So it had a great 10-year run, and I think that you sort of have to evolve in that way and under our understanding. And so I spent the latter portion of that decade working for LinkedIn and Microsoft, building public-private partnerships across North America, and again got really disillusioned with my ability to create change within those organizations as an entrepreneur. And so I left a couple years ago when I had a kid and wanted to be honest with her about what I do for a living and why. And now I'm making amends for my sins at a day called the Deus, which nowhere to take big tech money, and frankly spends most of its time in conversations like this, trying to push back on not just big tech, but a variety of aspects of tech's influence on society. And so we do 3 things. We do ed tech, and so how they see when classrooms, K-12, are being affected by a variety of forms of technology, from social media to just screens in classrooms. We won Canada's largest democracy event when we do a lot of work on AI. And in part, as a result of that latter work, particularly engaging our federal government, Jackie and I decided to begin collaborating on a standard, working with the Canadian Sand Association to see if we can turn DTPR, as Jackie described earlier, into something that is much more widely adopted. And we think even there are senators in Canada who currently think that sort of standards are the future of how we can possibly use those regulation, which I think will be part of our conversation today. The last thing I'll say, sorry for being so long, is I've been, since I left LinkedIn and Microsoft, a public AI fellow. I came across this idea that there could be an alternative to the sort of private dominance of this essential technology about 3 years ago via something called the Public AI Network, which is publicai.network, and that will feature in our conversation today as well. That's key.
Okay, so there's definitely a theme around legibility and shared language and how do we actually see the system. So why don't you walk us through what you think about how do we help community members better be able to see the systems that they're working with? How can we help them understand them? It's definitely more than just literacy. We're talking about legibility, and maybe we're talking about other elements of engagement as well. Why don't we don't have an order for this one, so we can, whoever wants to jump in first can go, but why don't we talk a little bit about how do we work with our community members to make sure we can all collectively see the thing we're trying to change?
That wants
Okay. I was going to start with you, Jackie, because you talk about legibility so much. Make it a little academic with it.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So I think we sort of really lean into this nutrition label metaphor. The idea that nutrition labels can take sort of complicated information, makes it easy for you to find. I think the public sector right now and organizations more broadly, regulators, when thinking about how we have more accountable technology, transparency is always like a principle, like this is like North Star. But the problem is we kind of do it in a shitty way right now. Like it's a really long PDF. It's like 60 pages. And I think a lot of times it actually doesn't answer the questions that the person on the street has, which is like, what change is this actually making in the world, and can it be seen? And so I think part of sort of enabling that community power to shape these systems is actually making sure that when we sort of go through efforts and think about efforts around transparency and explainability, I think there's so much money and technical effort going into AI explainability right now, and like, how does the AI make a decision? I don't think that's actually the answer. It's like, what is the decision that the AI is making and how that affects me? And so I think that's like a pivot that we need to sort of think about when we think about sort of like legibility and transparency. It's less about like explaining how the black box works, because it's a black box, like that's the point. But it's really, how does the black box impact the community, the space, the outcomes in the world? And I think that actually starts with going to people and asking them what they want to know, and then trying to sort of like build systems that enable that.
I love that. Yes. So when I think about the word legibility, it's a really rich term. And the political scientist who is really closely associated with this term, James C. Scott, was talking about legibility as a means to an end. So it's a way of seeing an object that makes it more amenable to an objective that you're trying to achieve. So when we think about legibility for public tech, you have to think about what is the goal of the legibility. And I think about the cookie, the cookie notices that we get, because very well-intentioned people designed GDPR to let us know when our data was being harvested when we use a website. And we get that cookie notice as a way of trying to make the system functioning more legible to us. But there wasn't enough thinking about what the end goal of that design intervention was, because it ends up individualizing our relationship with that interaction instead of boosting our capacity for collective action. So what would the cookie notice look like if it was instead trying to affect more collective response to data collection?
Can I make a chime on that? And I think that's where I think when we prepared for this panel, we all sort of like this idea, like you can opt out of an app, but you can't opt out of the infrastructure. It sort of really resonated, right? I think like there's been a lot of, I think the way we think about agency and our relationship with technology is I bought a thing, I installed a thing, I downloaded a thing. That is a business to consumer construct. Then that's almost like this false premise, right? Like you have control. But when we're talking about AI systems, sensor systems, smart city systems, they are not things that you can individually opt out of, because you can't opt out of the road, you can't opt out of the subway, you can't opt out to the park. And that's actually the metaphor that we have to, I think about. And like, I think like how can we bring, because these systems affect not just individuals, they affect groups of folks that are really diverse, that have different needs over medium-term time scales. Like I can't uninstall, subway station. Like it's not gonna happen. So it's like, what is the equivalent process that we can imagine to have that sort of collective decision making? And so I think that's something that's exciting to think about.
What everybody's been saying in preparing for this conversation, what became evident to me about our work, both as a think tank and me personally as a member of the Public Eye Network, is to think about how we can help agency via evidence. And so I think a lot of what you're describing is how to take a situation where cookies are not giving you any power. As Bodhi pointed out, they're like, in legal terms, contracts of adhesion. Like how do you either choose them or you don't go to the website in most cases, or you lose the ability to interact with the website in a more meaningful manner. And instead of taking the status quo as true as if it's the only path we could be going, even the way that sort of earlier you described AI hitting us as a wave, I think describes a lack of agency. Similarly, this use of the term agentic for AI, in my opinion, is just wrong right now. Until we get to AGI, it doesn't have agency, and therefore we should be owning that term and that power. And it's a visual definition of how humans control technology. I think how humans have control of themselves. Ourselves, I should say. So agency is on one side, and then the way that as a think tank we're trying to contribute to that is by adding evidence to a conversation where frankly there's a lot of mistruths, intentionally blending sort of whether it's misinformation or shaping narratives for the benefit of big tech. And so as an example, a ton of our work is on the labor market impacts of AI, where we're arguing that they are not, at least in the short term, going to be the catastrophe that Dario is claiming, but rather they're going to look a lot more like what the Nobel Prize winner Acemoglu won the Nobel Prize for saying, which is they're going to be the gradual impact that every other technology has had on our society if we ensure that they have that impact in a way that is socially beneficial. And I think that we can't. He's trying to suggest that we can control how we change our interactions based on this. And so I think that combination of evidence, and then maybe the last thing is what the public advocate adds, which is another path. Can we describe a different end goal? So one, for instance, in which AI is public infrastructure, and then work back from that end goal to the present so that we are actually building that infrastructure, we are regulating it quarterly, we are investing in it, both publicly and privately, as social organizations, as academics, etc.
Yeah, I think I just want to say that, like, I think we're all sort of reaching for having a conversation from different perspectives. And I think with the AI tidal wave, with the pace of change of the technology, I think one of the fundamental challenges is like, what are we talking about? And like, what is the thing doing? And I think we're still reaching for sort of like a shared language that can cut sort of like across sectors, across these different groups. And so I think that's something that like we want to build through conversations like this. But I think there's also, like, to your point, Jake, like, we shouldn't let big tech call it agentic AI. Like, maybe we need to, like, it needs to be a different name, and the power of language and like giving that naming ability to the technology organizations might actually be the place where we have to start.
So like, yesterday you pointed out an author who had crafted a different taxonomy for AI based on how it impacts us. I'm forgetting his name, but I was really impressed by both the way that you visually
Jonathan mentioned that.
So maybe Jonathan later can shout it out.
Yeah.
In essence, this person had created a taxonomy where it's like, how does what AI act, and therefore, like, is it perceiving, is it an analyzing, or is it generating? And therefore, you can be much more specific with the way that one is interacting, or with just, I guess, the way that you accept or don't accept its impact on you as an individual and us as society.
Okay, a question for the audience. How many of you are trained as designers or shapers of physical spaces? Landscape architects, planners, architects? Small group. I want to cut back to this notion of legibility. Meg talked about, Scott talking about legibility. Kevin Lynch, who's a very old playing designer guy, also talked about legibility. And legibility in that context was about building a common language for seeing the same thing. So trying to get everyone on the same page to figure out, how do we talk about this thing that we're seeing or we're experiencing in a way that we can connect with each other, which is a different dimension that's also important. And it leads us, I think, into this conversation and positioning of this panel about moving beyond thinking about AI just as a technology tool and as about infrastructure. I'm going to give Chelsea credit because in our getting ready for this conversation, Chelsea pointed out to us that one of the really important things about the infrastructure framing is that when we build new infrastructure, we have obligations to the public. If you're a municipal government and you want to build a new pipeline or you want to build a new water main, you have to do an environmental assessment. You have to think about what's the impact of this infrastructure on real people, real places, and real ecosystems. So that part's important. We should be thinking about the impacts of AI infrastructure on real people and on ecosystems. The other thing that infrastructure poses to us is that we have an obligation to go to the communities who are going to be impacted to talk to them about what's going to happen. We can engage them in conversations about, do you want this thing to happen here? Which also can invite NIMBY, which is both, challenging and oppositional. But it creates an opportunity to center community members' lived experiences as evidence and a valuable input in a decision-making process. And it also shares the power to decide yes or no and brings elected officials into the conversation. And so I want to talk a little bit about, share with everyone here, you're all deeply engaged in different communities of people. Tell us about the work you're doing to center users and residents' experiences. How do you elevate that at a time when people who have technological expertise like to use that as a way of keeping people out and not letting people into the conversation? So how do we center and elevate community members' experiences and make it matter in an AI as public infrastructure system?
Sure. Oh, excellent. So Historically, the IT departments in a government, for example, have been supporting enterprise systems. They've been provisioning your email and making sure the cybersecurity is taken care of and that you have a Microsoft Office suite. And now that that's why they're organized to be so internal and unilateral and technocratic, because these were considered very mundane, prosaic decisions. But as data intensive and AI technologies start permeating city services, all of a sudden you're enrolling IT departments in decisions that impact people's rights and essential public services. And they have not mostly been ready to follow suit the way that other city functions have with robust public engagement, the way you might see in planning, the way that Pamela is talking about. So how do you shift something like technology purchasing inside of the public sector? There is a really key moment before any procurement starts to shape the problem formulation. So you need to expose some of their starting assumptions to air and sunlight and a lot of different stakeholder perspectives. There are different creative ways to do this to get residents and community members enrolled in the ideation phase. One I'd really like to shout out in particular is happening in Long Beach, California. Where is Ryan Kurtzman? There he is, yes. So the Long Beach CoLab program is this design incubator where they actually give a stipend to residents to come in and have a more longitudinal design engagement to identify the problems in their community and then match those to technology solutioning, which that is one way to try to do bottom-up tech instead of top-down, the way that we're usually organized to do it. And then even if a technology is already in its pilot phase, it's going out the door, you can still get public input on the risk assessment process or the evaluation period. And in San Jose, they were moving forward with this, and talking a long time, essentially this computer vision system that was going to identify homeless residents and their lived-in vehicles. And I worked with the city to do a public consultation process that ended up flagging the huge public concerns with this and refocusing the problem definition into what residents were experiencing as road safety questions and maybe a better fit for the technology at hand. And the city was responsive to the feedback and totally shifted the scope of their object detection program. So, we're working hard to try to create resources to this end, but all of them have to do with shifting established practices and, the flight path of what IT is prepared to support.
Happy to jump in. I think there's two projects I thought that were good examples of what you're talking about. One, on the sort of transparency through literacy side, a little think tank brought to Canada study that had already been working quite well across swaths of the US and even more so Germany, where folks looked at where people trusted information coming from. And bizarrely, it wasn't journalists, it wasn't academia, it wasn't government, it was their employers. And so in an effort to get information to folks where they already trusted it, and in an effort to rebuild a public square that tech, social media in particular, had in many ways disintegrated, folks started pushing training on, for instance, misinformation, and I will bring this to Canada, disinformation, and now increasing the AI literacy through employers to their employees, which both was connecting those employees to each other and to their employers in a way that did end up, via this sort of private sector instrument, rebuilding aspects of that public square. So I think specific, targeted, relatively tested approaches like that are really valuable. That sort of recognize the very different information environment that we live in right now. The other example is much more about democratic accountability, because I think to some extent, if people are going to sort of own these technologies, so to speak, if these technologies are going to have the impact we already know they're having on our society, then we should have some ability to govern them. And that gets us closer to problems with how governance is working more generally right now. But some of the most interesting examples of potential futures come from things like deliberative democracy. And so right now, for instance, there's a bunch of online tools at places like Taiwan and Estonia are using in order to engage the public almost in real time on questions about when Uber is coming to town or what abortion rights should look like, etc. And if you had those same deliberative tools, something called Polis, BOL.is is one open source example, used to gather people's views, for instance, on how they wanted to interact with AI or how they wanted AI in their society, and hypothetically, you could actually embed people's values in how the AI is working, for instance, in something like its constitution. And you could even have a law saying, if the AI is not following that democratic perspective on how the AI should be affecting that you, then the AI is illegal. And so tying our technological to our democratic to our legal system is, I think, possible, but it's so far from the current reality that folks are having a hard time imagining it.
Before Jackie jumps in, I just want to show there, Daniel, where are you? Daniel Fusco, another Toronto person. Daniel's doing a session tomorrow that it brings in deliberative democracy principles into conversations about AI. It's at 10:45 tomorrow, breakout block B. Okay, good, Jackie.
That's funny because I was actually make sure you check out Daniel's section.
Try to connect the dots.
Yeah, so I think, I think the projects that we work on and the sort of things that we do, like fundamentally the open source DTPR project is trying to recenter and codify whose expertise counts, right? There are plenty of standards organizations and standards bodies that are built by industry for industry. And this is the DTPR is really an attempt to be like, this is what people want to know, to get big technology buyers like cities, like campuses, like private sector organizers, and be like, these are the questions when you purchase and when you deploy this, you need to be able to answer these questions. And I think that's actually really interesting because then it actually shifts it from cybersecurity is a checkbox and you just have to get through this form, or and it's just sort of actually brings into that sort of purchasing process these community-centered questions that might otherwise get missed because that CIO's please leave me alone with my servers. I do not have this job because I'm excited about talking to people I work with many of those folks. So I think that's something to sort of think about. When in our project with Sydney Olympic Park, when they deploy DTPR, they've actually written sort of asking their technology vendors for digital trust replaces and routines data chain, as part of that sort of vetting process. It's part of with Michigan Central Innovation District, which is a P3 partnership that we work with and support. That's part of their intake process for startups that want to pilot in the space. So I think this is where having a checklist that is not about what the technology experts need to know, but what the people need to know becomes a way to start to institutionalize that.
I think just before we move on to our next question, we should also just caution everyone that if you go out and talk to the public using language like government uses around community engagement and consultation, you need to be really careful if you have no obligation to actually follow up with your community members. We really need to remember that community time is precious. If you ask folks for their opinion, they are giving you the gift of their expertise. Don't squander it. Don't ask for things that you can't act on, but also don't break the trust bonds that the folks inside the proper processes are desperately trying to hang on to. Anybody who works directly with the public inherits all of the sins of everyone else's bad public engagement processes of before. And Meg and I first met through this really great kind of ongoing conversation about technology and engagement practices. And one of the things that really freaked me out as a planner was how many technology firms were running engagement processes that looked like typical government democratic engagement, but it was basically just focus group and product development work. And I understand why they wanted that input, but we really have to be careful when we ask folks for their time and their expertise that we honor what we've been given and work with it carefully. So that's my panelist editorial intervention. All right. Speaking of infrastructure, power, and open alternatives, if we're really going to think hard about AI as a civic infrastructure and a public system, what kinds of ecosystems do we need to sustain democratic accountability and try to work towards being more inclusive rather than extractive and creating dependencies? And while you're thinking about that big question, I'm going to throw into what are the real leverage points for power and shifting it into the people who really need to have it?
Happy to start. In part, I'm starting because, to your second question, I was a lobbyist who managed Microsoft's lobbyists on behalf of LinkedIn for long enough to know that at least at the levels of some of the larger governments in North America, it really is a people thing first. It's like persuading individual human beings that something is an important idea first, and then a process or technology or other problem next. And knowing that order is key, in my opinion, because it allows you to sort of focus your resources on the leverage points that are arguably most easy to move and will create the largest amount of change. So as I said, lobbying staffers as an example is, in my opinion, a very effective way to create change, and unfortunately has been captured to a very significant extent by big tech and other large financial players. And so once you have that as like a bit of a background, I think you can then move to how do we create other community movements. And it was actually really inspired yesterday hearing about a bunch of sort of ground up community movements, particularly at the city level, that can push back on that and create sort of effective change. And also, I think to your point about worry about sort of ethics washing, there is a consistent trend, particularly amongst large technology companies right now, to start seeking input in exactly the ways you described, and then going down a path as if that input would hold them accountable. So for instance, Nonprofit had exactly the process I described before, where their constitution was crafted by a deliberative process, and then at some point just threw it out the window and change direction. And so finding ways to ensure that there is ongoing accountability, I think, is one answer to your question. We're hold the private sector to account the way that we have for most of human history, but for some reason we sort of lost that muscle in the past decade.
You're asking about what kinds of ecosystems could support democratic accountability. Any of us who are not currently in a tech company are having a scale issue, I will call it, because if any one of us tries to impact this behemoth, nothing happens. And an example I like to think about is the city of San Jose decided to get tough with its vendors and started asking them a set of questions that they called a fact sheet. They said, all of our vendors need to fill this out, and they sent it to Google and crickets, which is not surprising, but they are scrappy and determined, and they banded together with what soon became, in less than 3 years, 900 other local governments, state, county, cities. It's electrifying. Another shout out to Ryan and others of you in this room who've been to that entity. It's called the GovAI Coalition. And it is an avenue for collective action where instead of being ignored, now cities and small government and large government can synchronize their requests to ask collectively for the same set of information. And that really changes the power dynamics between the requester and these multinational tech corporations. So I think that all of us in every sector can learn from the GovAI Coalition to begin to create what I call social infrastructure. Like, what is the existing organizational capacity to pool data, to pool requests, to build our own public AI, or to share lessons learned from governance. There are so many different ways that we could be acting collectively, and it is going to take that skill to affect democratic accountability.
Yeah, I love that we're talking about infrastructure and everything that's not like a concrete or metal thing. We're talking people infrastructure and process infrastructure and democratic infrastructure. And I think what's interesting is thinking about the role of actually a long-standing efforts in accountability, like the open data movement, which is now, I don't even know how many years old it is, at least 10, maybe 15. 15, thank you. And as much as I think we're seeing, open data, I think people were involved in open data in the early days were like, we're not sure if that actually sort of resulted in the impact that we're starting to see. And we were thinking about standards, and maybe data standards will help us unlock this. What is actually interesting now is that that is serving as the foundation for a lot more work in actual like enabling accountability. Like actually, Nathan Story is in the room somewhere building Civic AI tools, which is trying to sort of actually thinking about this, scary AI infrastructure, these scary AI tools, but then how can we actually use that to unlock the stories that open data is telling us? And then actually even in our work, which Jonathan will talk about later this afternoon, we're using open data to try to improve this open standard and like iterating on that. So I think there is something about like continuing at government and organizational levels to prioritize that openness and making and unlocking information and putting it out there. And I think the next step is then actually building the capacity, the skills, the people and process infrastructure to make use of it.
Right, here you get to ask each other questions. What's a question you're wrestling with that you think someone else on the panel could help you think through?
Just jump in because I've been waiting for this opportunity. I didn't know something was coming. But I've long admired data in society, since I learned about it many, many years ago. And now we're on an organization that is trying to come up with our theory of change, as well as sort of financial sustainability in a really different environment than when I started engaging with this think tank, I will say 3 years ago as a fellow. At that point, we were taking money from big tech, and we weren't nearly as focused on the negative impacts of technology on our society. To the contrary, we were often advocating for more tech in our society. And since then, I think we've become much more excited, for instance, about Canada's risk aversion and not adopting AI as fast as most countries as maybe a natural human defense mechanism. But that leaves us still trying to figure out what we do as an organization in terms of what should our business model be and how do we affect change in this very different environment where, despite mass, for instance, in the US and Canada, apprehension about AI's impact on us, very little power amongst these individuals who are feeling that, or the organizations like ours that are trying to research it and then create change around it.
Thank you so much, Jake. Also, shout out to my colleague Anya, who's here from Data and Society, if you guys want to connect after. There's no way around it. We are in a hideous, nationally and globally, funding contraction that is precipitated by the dissolution of USAID and mortal wounds to NSF. And that has percolated across philanthropy in unexpected ways that are causing some of these big questions that you're asking about financial sustainability for all of us in civil society. And it's not just us, but when you go overseas and you have these conversations, everyone in the world is feeling it, which is very sobering. So what I would say, if we're all trying to think about where is there some give or where could we think about the value proposition, one thing that Data and Society does that most people don't know about because they're often invite only is a lot of cross-sector closed-door convenings. And it is, for policy, for example, we'll invite policymakers to meet with academics, to have a chief question of interest. I'm going on a little bit too long, but what I've learned from the last few years is that these relationships that you can foster between sectors are actually extremely powerful. You are cross-pollinating the priorities between sectors, and you are building a deep bench of capacity for your allies across sectors to reach into and stand up some incredible things. So I think that's something people would pay for. That's just one thought off the top of my mind.
Helpful, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions you ask?
Okay, or can I ask a question? I'm going to ask a question of Jake. So I think it was in our prep call. You said something which was like, people currently can't even imagine an alternative to the big five. And so to an alternative to the AI delivered by these big companies. And so I think my question for you is, how do we actually think about the public AI or the public infrastructure model feel as real and inevitable as the private one that we have now. So this is the invitation to dream very big.
Well, actually, I think the examples already exist. So there's this group, for instance, in Switzerland that created something called Apertus, APERTUS. And it's part of the public AI network's public release now, where if you just go to chat.publicai.co, you can use something that is as good as ChatGPT or Claude was 3 to 6 months ago. Well, it depends on the month. And frankly, that's good enough for the vast majority of the purposes that one needs, except in this case, it's trained on data that has not been copyrighted, or the copyright's been cleared. It has a constitution that is aligned with either Swiss values or now there's a Singaporean and an American version. And it's free. And it's never going to be owned by these 5 companies. So that's one of many, many examples that exist out there. And I think we have to begin to be willing to sacrifice some degree of being at that absolute cutting edge, particularly when it is clearly a hype cycle. The financial implications of this hype cycle are not lost on the governors of banks. Most major developed countries right now, the IMF is saying we're going to have a crash. And so the fact that we're in this hype cycle means that we should be taking a step back and saying what's much more sustainable. One of them is options like Apertus and public AI networks, but the Allen Lab, the Mozilla, and others are offering all sorts of do-it-yourself solutions for small language models, which again are often much more appropriate for a small nonprofit or government to be using for specific purposes, rather than always reaching for this shiny, and it's not a toy, actually, this shiny, extremely expensive, environmentally intensive resource that has been cornered by cloud companies in the West and China.
So you're saying we need like a mind shift from like the best tech to like the good enough tech. It makes me think about like what was that thing NASA spent like a ton of money trying to design pen that would work in zero gravity, and like
It's space.
then the Russians rule. But there's a pencil. So that's what that. But I think yes, those like open models do exist. Those free models do exist. But I feel like a challenge that I see, I'm curious how folks, you or folks or others of public AI network it's just not as easy to onboard into those, right? And that's where the big 5 have
100%.
the sort of like
They have the US into Linux for servers because you can plug it into all the rest of their ecosystem more easily. And I think that friction is completely what we need more of it. We need to be able to stomach the reality that moving more slowly, having more friction, that not having that same scale is actually the healthier, more humane, better for our society and better for us as individuals approach. But that takes getting beyond a huge amount of rhetoric, decades of us thinking that software is going to make the world better. And I was the biggest believer in internet, and Twitter 1.0, and all these things actually bringing us together. Evidently, if you got that wrong, and I think there's a degree of humility that's necessary at this point to recognize that we got that wrong and move in a different direction.
Great. So we have less than 5 minutes left. So rather than rush audience questions, we're going to wrap up the panel and make up the time, which gives us more time at lunch to talk to each other. So we're going to end on a more hopeful, optimistic note, I think. I'll start with Meg and we'll work our way back to me. Let's end with a development or a project or a shift that you see happening right now that gives you hope that we have the ability to actually deliver more accountable and community-centered approaches that are really possible. Meg.
Thanks, Pamela. This has been a great conversation. Thanks, y'all. I'd say that responsible AI has had a tough last couple of years. Responsible AI folks have lost their jobs inside of companies, and they were overall getting framed as kind of a bummer or scolds, and they're going to, slow down technology's progress. But something that gives me hope is that we have seen a huge public response to data centers across, left and right axis. It's something that the public is really invested in and cares about, and it shows that there is a broad bipartisan support for people having more determinative influence in how technology comes to their communities. So I draw a lot of hope from that.
I think it's actually rooms like this that been giving me sufficient hope to keep going these days. And thankfully been in them once every 2 or 3 days where we're in group with like-minded folks. I think the one added diversity that at least yesterday was less present than I might have hoped would be a significant presence in the private sector, since that just like dominates our economy in so many ways that to be realistic, one has to have that presence very present. But beyond that, it really is communities that are painting walls, that are painting pictures of a world that I believe in and that I can then try to help them build via the tools that I have whenever the organization that I work at, etc. That's what gives me hope. And it's pretty vocal, like it's visceral. I have to sort of be able to hear and smell the person. So I always say, like, the reason I hate public speaking online is because you can't, that's no like pheromones, right? There is an energy in this room that I can feel from up here, and I think we need more of that, and that probably means that it can't always be technologically integrated.
Yes to this room, yes to the protests around data centers. I think what's been giving me hope is I have a 9-year-old, and my school and his parents and his parents, not me, and then the parents of the other kids and the school is like, we are deep in a conversation of like, how do we not give these kids smartphones? And it's a pain in the ass, it's hard, or unlearning all sorts of things. But I think the willingness to have this sort of like very local, neighborly conversation about like, how do we want to bring this technology in and whether or not we even should has been giving me hope, because I still remember like tabling in the fall with this other mom, and I was like, no one's gonna come talk to us. And then we signed up like 3/4 of the school in like a month to not give our kids social media until they turn at least 15, or like delay smartphones until grade 6. So I was just like, oh, there's actually something here. And I think there's this like collective awakening that we're seeing. We're seeing in the commencement speeches that did not go that well for certain tech CEOs yesterday. And I think that's really exciting.
So I'm going to say thanks. We all gathered together around this question around what are the enabling conditions for civic infrastructure in an age of AI. And I think it's been a really interesting conversation from different vantage points. I also just want to say on a hopeful note, it's really great to see new folks at the table, but also welcome back to all the civic tech people from 10 years ago. Happy to see you. Really good skills though, like really important community building, a desire to work together. That community is important and much needed in this space. And then there are new folks here too. And I think the fact that this conversation drew in such interesting people sets the stage for, we have a day and a half left for really important and interesting conversations. So thank you for your time. Thank you to all of you. And we'll move on. Yeah, great. Thank you.